Welcome, everyone. I am Bob Wurzelbacher, the director of the Respect Life Office for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, and this is our video podcast series that we call Being Pro-Life. Each month, we'll hear a different topic in the Respect Life arena. We'll hear a personal story from someone deeply affected by that issue, and finally, we'll share ways that you can get involved. Today's guest is Dr. Joe Zalot, Director of Education and Fellow Ethicist for the National Catholic Bioethics Center in Pennsylvania. Today's topic is in vitro fertilization, what it is, and Catholic teaching on the topic. Joe, welcome to the show.
Hey, Bob, great to be here.
So, Joe, why don't you tell us just a little bit about yourself and maybe how and why you became an ethicist at the National Catholic Bioethics Center?
Yeah, it's kind of a long story, but I'll give you the real brief version. I've always been interested in my faith and did a PhD at Marquette University, finished up in 2002. And then I was a college professor for a while. In fact, I was teaching at Mount St. Joseph University in Cincinnati for about 11 years. In fact, my wife and daughter and I lived in Cincinnati on the west side for about 15 years. And during that time, while I was at Mount St. Joe's, I taught really all of the ethics classes. So business ethics, healthcare ethics, sexual ethics, kind of intro to Christian ethics. And things just started focusing more on healthcare for any number of different reasons. We taught the healthcare ethics class at some of the hospitals in Cincinnati through the Bachelor of Science and Nursing program that the university had. And things just started swinging that way. 2015, Mercy Health, now Bon Secours Mercy Health in Cincinnati, asked me to come on as a regional director of ethics and was there for 2 years. And then the NCBC called in 2017, and I've been with the NCBC since then. So it's really been kind of a process, and I think the Holy Spirit has had his hand in all of this as well, too.
Where's the NCBC located in the country?
So we are just outside of Philadelphia. We're in the suburb of Broomall, Pennsylvania. It's about 20 minutes to half an hour directly west of Philadelphia.
People probably haven't heard of the National Catholic Bioethics Center. Real quick, what is your role in the church?
We have been called the best kept secret in the church.
Right.
And maybe there's a good reason for that. We're trying to change that a little bit. But basically, the NCBC is a think tank for Catholic healthcare ethics. So we were established primarily to advise the U.S. bishops. So that's what we do. We advise the USCCB. We have educational programs for the bishops. But really, our three main areas of our work, I should say. The first is consultation. So we have a 24/7 consultation service that people can call us and email us, and they ask us questions, healthcare-related questions about everything. And we get somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 consults a year. And I've answered a couple thousand myself. So that's one of the things we do. We also have a publications department, so we have a number of books, and we also publish guides for parishes. We have guides on end-of-life decision-making, advanced directives, POLST, things like that, palliative care and hospice. And then thirdly, what I'm mostly involved with is education. So as the director of education, I oversee our certification program, which is our 9-month program. It's our deep dive into Catholic healthcare ethics, fully online program. And anybody who's watching this podcast can enroll in it. We also have our chaplain program, which is basically an online introduction to the ethical and religious directives for Catholic healthcare services, which is the U.S. bishops' guidelines for how we provide care in Catholic healthcare systems. And also, we have a high school program. We're partnering with, it used to be called Catholic Distance University, now it's called Catholic International University, but we partner with them and we have an undergraduate level Introduction to Catholic Healthcare Ethics course. We at the NCBC do the content, and that course is available to high school students, and students can earn college credit for it through Catholic International University. So that's a new initiative, and we're just starting that. We're working with a couple schools, but we're always looking to work with more.
You mentioned the national certification. I went through that myself. So if anyone's listening, I can vouch for that. It's a terrific program. You're working with many of the ethicists at the NCBC. If you have the inclination to learn more about Catholic teaching and Catholic ethics and kind of grapple, some of it is grappling with questions, right?
Oh, yeah.
Of serious examples. And it's just fascinating, I think as well. So today's topic is in vitro fertilization, IVF. So before we get too much, right, the church teaching about the topic and everything, why don't you just tell us what is it and what's involved in the process of IVF?
All right, so IVF, or in vitro fertilization, as you said, essentially it's a process of manufacturing children. That's what it is. So if couples are experiencing infertility, they will be oftentimes referred to an IVF practice. And I just want to say this off the top, Bob, is that I'm going to refer to it as the IVF industry. And it really is an industry because it's there to make money.
Right.
That's really important. I think people really need to know that. But basically, what the process is very quickly is that a woman, she's given medications to stimulate ovulation, usually Clomid or something similar. So she ovulates multiple eggs. And then from the father, hopefully the husband, sperm is gained through masturbation, which raises all sorts of concerns in and of itself, as that is morally wrong in itself. But then the egg and the sperm are put together in a petri dish, and fertilization hopefully happens. Hopefully numerous embryos are manufactured through this process. Then what happens is a technician screens the various embryos and determines which they believe are most viable, quote unquote. And then those embryos will be implanted into the mother. The leftovers will either be frozen in case the first round doesn't work. You've got the second team in the freezer ready to go, or they're simply destroyed. So these are human embryos that are being frozen or destroyed. The embryos that are in the mother, hopefully one or more will develop, and 9 months later, a child will be born. So that's, in short, that's the process.
So you already pretty much mentioned a lot of the big problems right
Yeah,
there.
I couldn't help myself.
Yeah, that's quite all right. That's the next thing we were going to get into, right? I mean, there's a lot of beauty around the Catholic teaching on some issues with IVF, but let's absolutely start with those ethical problems that you already began with. That I think if most people understood just from that standpoint, they would realize, wow, there are some things I didn't realize that were so problematic about IVF. So let's get more into some of those problems that are really ethical issues for thinking about IVF.
Yeah. So let's start at the beginning. So the woman has to be hyperstimulated to ovulate a number of eggs. And the drugs that are given to her, they have medical complications with them as well. All right. So a lot of people think that the woman takes these medications, she ovulates numerous eggs, but there are a lot of medical complications and some serious complications. And I have all of this. People want to be in touch. I'm happy to share that. Do women know who are going through IVF? Do they have informed consent? There's medical issues even with the ovulation process. We mentioned with the man to donate sperm, that's done through masturbation. Again, so that raises a lot of concerns as well, too. But then once the egg and the sperm have been harvested, then what really happens is that the process or the success, quote unquote, of IVF is really dependent upon the work of the technicians. So what you're doing is you're taking procreation out of a natural loving act between a husband and wife, and you're entrusting it to the skill, so to speak, of a technician. So life is being manufactured not in the woman's body as it should be, as nature has created it to be, as God has created it to be. It's being manufactured in a petri dish. And then, as I mentioned before, the technician will subjectively grade which embryos he or she believes are the most viable. So what's happening is this very nascent human life in embryonic form is being objectified. Which is the best? Which is the worst? And those that are deemed to be the best are selected for implantation. So those 2, 3, 4 embryos are implanted into the mother. The rest, they could either be destroyed if it's deemed that embryo number 10 here is never going to be viable on anything, so let's discard it in medical waste, which they do, which discarding a nascent human life, or we're going to freeze. And the reason why they freeze embryos is because the whole process of IVF is very expensive, $20,000 or more. So if the first round doesn't work, you've got kind of the second team ready to go. We'll come back to the frozen embryos in a few minutes, but let's go back to the embryos that have been implanted into the mother. So they'll implant multiple embryos with the hope that one, maybe two, will take. They'll implant in the uterus and the pregnancy will continue. But what happens in some cases is that you'll have 2, you'll have 3, maybe all 4 of them will take. And then you have a multiple pregnancy, which is the expenses go up and the medical complications go up.
Right.
And so what doctors will do is they'll say, well, hey, Bob, let's selectively reduce the pregnancy. And they do an abortion procedure and they kill 1 or 2 of the embryos that are in the womb. So here you have a situation, women have talked about this, that I've been infertile for years. I finally become pregnant. And then I kill, or I have 1 or 2 of my children killed so that the 2 that are remaining have a better chance of survival. Wow. And so you can see there's all sorts of issues going on with that.
I don't remember how long ago it was, 20 years? The famous Octomom, the woman who had 8 children, right? Now, is that, obviously she must have had 8 or more even embryos planted in her womb and then they all survived, right? Is my understanding that I don't know a whole lot of detail that they tend to not even try to implant that many at once in the first place. Right? There's even been some laws around. Are you up to date on they don't do any more than four anymore, at least, or they don't do any more than, or it depends on the clinic.
Yeah, the Nadia Suleiman case. That's what that was. You've got to give Nadia Suleiman credit because she didn't do quote unquote selective reduction. She brought all of her children to life. But yeah, you see, her case demonstrates that IVF is really the wild, wild west. Some countries in Europe do. I believe Germany and Italy do have, you can only create as many embryos as you're going to implant. So I think maybe because of Nadia Suleiman or others, clinics will limit the number of embryos that they'll do introduce to the woman. But I'm not aware of any federal or state law that limits the number of embryos.
Right. You said you've talked to women. Have you heard stories of women didn't even realize that they were going to be asked after pregnancy that, oh, or were they told from the beginning, it may happen that you have three, four viable children, and we're going to ask you to reduce the number, or they were surprised by that later in the process?
I think the women that I've heard of who've talked about this, they will say that were they told that this could be a possibility? I think they said they may have been, but to be honest with you, they so much want a child that
Right.
they're willing to do anything. And so, you may get an informed consent form that may say something to the effect of if carrying more than two children, we're going to
Right.
recommend quote unquote selective reduction. And they just don't even pay attention to it until the reality comes around. And it's the same thing actually with the frozen embryos, but we could get to that in a couple of minutes.
And then, of course, language has a lot too. You call it selective reduction. You're not
Right.
even thinking about it as literally killing your children. And yet you're right, that's exactly what it is.
It is exactly what it is. Yeah.
Those that aren't even implanted in the first place. It's so expensive to do the whole process again over and over. So you get as many as you can at once. You implant some of them and you freeze the rest of them. And then what happens?
Well, and actually, there's a lot of people who are in this situation right now. We'll hear from couples who, they've done IVF and they had no idea that it was contrary to church teaching. And now they're in this situation. So they may have had a child or two through IVF. And for whatever reason, it could be age, it could be other reasons, they are finished having children. But now, well, maybe they got 4, 5, 6, 8 frozen embryos in cold
Yeah.
storage. And the question becomes, okay, what do we do with them? I
Right.
know the abortion industry and society as a whole doesn't want to recognize that, but the fact of the matter is these are human beings. And what are we doing about them? And it's very expensive actually to keep them frozen. It's a few $1,000s a year. So depending on, some people may think that's very expensive, some others may not. But there's a cost every year to keep them frozen. So the question is, okay, what do we do with them? And some of the options are, well, you could unthaw them, they'll die, and then destroy them. That's problematic. You could donate them to science. There are scientists who are doing experiments on embryos. And in fact, those who are doing embryonic experiments, that's where they get a good number of their embryos, is from IVF, quote unquote, leftovers. That's a problem. And then another option is embryo adoption, which there is a lot of, don't want to get into that here, but there is a lot of discussion about the morality or immorality of that. In fact, we at the NCBC, we have differences of opinion on the question of, is it permissible to put one's embryos up for adoption or to adopt another person's embryo? And the church has not definitively taught about it. So there's some room for discussion. But I've talked to couples and there are many couples out there who are in this exact situation. They've done IVF. It's not practical for them to implant those children. That's what we should do, actually, is that those children should be implanted in their biological mother, but maybe there's practical reasons that they can't. And now they're in a quandary. What do I do with these embryos? And this is a huge, huge question. And nobody knows. Estimates are 1 million, 1.5 million, maybe more frozen embryos in the United States right now as we speak. And what do we do with them? And there's not a good answer.
Do you know, is there a shelf life for this frozen embryo process?
That's a really good question. The longest I know of an embryo that was frozen that was then implanted into a woman and was born was 23 years. So that has happened. Now, I think most people would believe that as time goes by, those frozen embryos are going to become less viable. But I don't know if that's just an opinion or if there's actually medical science behind that. But that's a really good question. I mean, we've had probably frozen embryos from the 90s or maybe even in the 80s that are still there. Yeah.
You said a little bit in the beginning, you said something about some of the difficulties with stimulating the ovaries to make them produce more eggs, right? Did you say that there were more side effects than people are aware of related to that? Or what are some of those issues?
Yeah, so there's a number of side effects that can happen. So just in terms of egg retrieval, what are some of the issues that arise? Some of the lesser issues, so to speak. Ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, which can result in nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, kidney ovary damage, those types of things. The process in some cases can lead to loss of fertility. There's what they call ovarian torsion or twisting of the ovaries and cysts. Women have experienced strokes, kidney disease, premature menopause. These are issues that arise with the egg retrieval procedure. There's also a number of complications that arise for women with IVF itself. For example, there's greater instances of diabetes, hypertension, obesity, things like that. And obviously, the multiple pregnancies is another issue as well, too. There's also medical risks for children who have been born of IVF, related risks to cancer, leukemia, tumors, any number of different things. Studies have demonstrated children who are the product of IVF experience at greater levels than those who are conceived naturally. So, the process is not neutral in terms of health. It has impacts on the women's health. It has impact on the children's health. And these are things that many people do not know.
You mentioned children born of IVF, so we should get into that just a little bit at least, right? I know when I've talked about IVF, I've had people think they hear in that message anything negative about people who have been born of IVF.
Right.
What is church's teaching about people who have been born of IVF?
Well, the church's teaching about children who are born of IVF is the same as anybody who's been born under any circumstance,
Right.
And that they are a child of God. They are fully a child of God. There's no issue with them at all.
They
Yeah,
have
there's
the exact same level of human dignity as
absolutely,
everybody else.
absolutely, as everybody else. We have children who are conceived in very terrible circumstances. I mean, obviously, there's cases of rape. There's no diminishment of human dignity at all. Perhaps the circumstances whereby a child has been conceived or manufactured, in the case of IVF, are morally wrong. But that has no impact on the child, right? The child is, as you said, is fully a child of God, fully deserving of dignity and respect that all children are deserving of.
Right.
But interesting, just along with that, is what the studies are finding now about children who are IVF children. When they find out the process of IVF, what they're realizing is, oh my goodness, I have all these siblings. What has happened to my siblings? The frozen siblings, or the ones who were
Right.
destroyed, or the ones who didn't make it. And in some cases, there's actually kind of a survivor's guilt in the sense of, why am I here and my brothers and sisters are not? So what we're recognizing more and more is that there are psychological and other impacts on the children of IVF.
Right. That either I had some siblings right there in the womb with me and who were killed and I was saved, or I literally have siblings frozen in a lab somewhere and I can't do anything about it. Okay, so you mentioned the issues with the drugs and fertility, but probably more obvious ethical issues are all the multiple embryos, selective reduction, which is simply abortion, and then all the frozen embryos of which we literally do not know what to do with because we
Right.
can't implant them all into the mother because we had to create a whole lot more than were actually used. But even if back to the selective reduction, even if you're choosing what sounds at first like kind of a noble reasoning, or we're just choosing the healthiest one, the one that is most likely to survive, right? That's the one we're saving, right? And we're going to get rid of the others. That right there says a lot about, obviously, for anyone who was born. I think the vast majority of people walking around on the planet know that we wouldn't imagine to kill people for having a certain disability. But for some reason, people don't think of it that way when they're in the mother's womb. Then it sounds different somehow, right? But it's the same thing. You're choosing based on the genetics or based on, survivability. You're choosing
Yep.
what are the criteria under which this human being is worth more than this human being. Clearly, that is against what we should all agree should be common with human dignity. And my goodness, and if it is based on whatever else can be read, like even gender, like I want a girl or I want a boy. I mean, How flippant can some of these reasoning be, perhaps, right? For choosing who to save and who not to save.
But actually, if I could just jump in there for a
Go
second,
ahead.
that's exactly what happens today.
Yeah.
So when the embryos are manufactured in the petri dish, the technicians can screen them, and they will actually screen out those who have, say, there was a Down syndrome. Let's say there's a genetic anomaly here or there. They are screened out. It's exactly what you're talking about here. When couples do IVF, they can choose a boy or a girl, and the clinics give them that choice. We can tell, and it's the objectifying of those embryos. What it is it's giving parents what they want. And
Right.
the whole IVF industry is based on this idea that you adults have a right to a child, which you don't, and we're going to give you the child with the characteristics that you want because we have the technology to do it. And
Right.
that's really what the IVF industry is doing.
Even if the IVF industry only created one at a time, right? And we didn't have the frozen embryos and we didn't have selective reduction, if we didn't have any of those very real problems, what is the problem with this manufacturing that is contrary to church teaching and understanding of human dignity and the sacredness of marriage?
At its base, I mean, we've talked about a lot of different practical issues, but philosophically or theologically, what's problematic with IVF is that it takes procreation away from a natural loving act between a husband and wife, and it entrusts it to, well, as we said before, it entrusts it to technicians, but what it does is it takes procreation away from how nature intended it, how God intended it. So the church talked about this back in the 1980s in a document called Dunham Vitae. And the church has held that every child has the right to be conceived of, gestated by, and born of its biological mother and father, right? And this goes back to, Humanae Vitae and earlier, where the marital act, we always have to uphold union and procreation, right? The procreative aspect and the unitive aspect, those always have to be together. You can't separate those. IVF obviously separates those. And what happens is instead of a child having the right to being conceived, gestated by, born of its biological parents, it's all turned around and it's become about the rights of the parents. So from the church's perspective, aside from all of the practical ethical issues that we've talked about, it violates the dignity of the parents, the husband and wife to become parents only through each other, and it violates the right of the child to be conceived of an act of love between its mother and father.
What does the church say? Because it's a very real problem. You're saying that everybody doesn't have a right to a child, but a married couple desperately wants a child
Mhm.
and their friends are getting
Right.
pregnant. If we can't do IVF, what can we do to help them?
Well, what we do is we encourage people to look into what's called either NAPRO technologies, natural reproductive technologies, or restorative reproductive technologies. They mean very similar things. IVF does not seek to address the underlying causes of infertility. Right. So for
Right.
couples experiencing infertility, IVF doesn't care why you're infertile. They're just going to grab eggs, grab sperm, put them together in a petri dish, and put them back into the mother's body. What NAPRO technologies or restorative reproductive technologies do is actually look to what is causing the infertility, and then they treat it. In fact, I've got a friend who practices NAPRO technology, restorative reproductive technology, and he says that IVF, give or take, is successful, leading to a live child maybe 20 to 25% of the time. That's going to depend on the age of the woman and other factors. Whereas restorative reproductive technologies, talking 40%, give or take. So it's twice as effective, and it costs 1/4 the amount of money.
Right.
So what we do is we say, let's go this route. Right. And try to actually determine what's causing the infertility. Is there something physical with the mother? Is there something physical with the father? Let's treat that. And there are a lot of physicians around the country who practice restorative reproductive technology or NAPRO technology and have had a lot of success helping couples who were experiencing infertility to have children. In fact, this doctor who I spoke to said that he's actually had couples who've tried and failed with IVF come to him, and he's helped them have children the natural way.
And most people don't even know about this. You would think that if you have had a problem with anything, in your body, the first thing you would want to do is see if that can be fixed. That's
Yeah.
probably not the best word, right?
No, it is. That's exactly. Yeah.
See if, right, if you have a problem with infertility, what is the problem? And let's see if we can resolve that problem so that you can conceive and start there, not start with some workaround that simply avoids the question of,
Exactly.
can we address this problem? You were talking about NAPRO technology, and we have at least one that I'm familiar with right here. We have some worldwide listeners, but the vast majority of them are from the geography of the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, Cincinnati-Dayton, a little bit north. Dr. Jason Mattingly is one of the doctors that we know well that works in NAPRO technology.
Jason's a great guy too. I've known him
Yeah.
for a number of years, and I see him at Catholic Medical Association conferences. In fact, I just talked to him just a few weeks ago about something. So, yeah, he's a good guy. Look him up.
I didn't warn you about this question in the beginning, but I always like to end a podcast with saying, okay, what could the regular person in the pew do related to this issue, right? So, like, how can you get involved?
Well, I think the main thing that people can do is to become educated. I think
Right.
a lot of it is, people just don't know. And I can tell you there are priests who don't know, about the topics that we're talking about. So, I mean, as far as learning more, people could come to our website, ncbcenter.org. We've got information about in vitro fertilization and many other things on our webpage. If anybody's interested in joining our certification program, you can do that as well, too. I have to put that plug in. But I think the big thing is becoming educated and then having the courage to be able to talk to people about this. A family member who, maybe is experiencing infertility, and it's a very difficult cross to bear. But let them know that there are other options. Because what happens is, for a lot of couples, they are pushed very quickly into IVF. And there are other options. And to let them know about those options. And, also let them know there are downsides to IVF. We don't hear about those. All you hear about is, look, this beautiful child was born. But what you don't realize is that for every child who is born, I think the last figure I heard is 8 embryos are destroyed for every child who's born through IVF. And all of the other medical issues and ethical issues that we talked about. And, when couples go down the road of IVF, oftentimes they end up with the quandary of the embryos, things that they didn't expect. You can avoid all of that, or try to avoid all that, and encourage them to go to a NAPRO-trained doctor like Dr. Mattingly or others to say, hey, what's actually causing the infertility? And I think having these conversations with people, and it's probably going to be, family members. So, maybe parents with their children, or, their children of childbearing age, they're experiencing infertility. There's a lot of infertility in the world today. Couples are getting married later. And so the window of fertility is much shorter. And as women get older, as we know, fertility decreases. So that's one of the reasons why IVF is so prevalent today. But have those conversations with people and just educate them about the realities of IVF.
All right, Joe. So you mentioned that you're from the National Catholic Bioethics Center. I want to share the screen of that website real quick. Of course, if you're listening on the podcast, you can't see it, but www.ncbcenter.org. There's the website. And I'm seeing right up here the National Catholic Certification Program. We mentioned that. You can click it if you're interested in looking into that. Look at that.
Look at
New video.
surprise.
Why is IVF wrong?
Yeah, that's what our father.
Infertility.
Yeah, that's Father Tad Waholchik.
Great.
So, yeah.
And there's your podcast, Bioethics on Air with Joseph Zalot. So you have a regular podcast yourself on different topics. Take us through, what can people find on your website?
Well, if you're looking for resources, you see, Bob, the button that says NCBC Resources right in the middle.
Right there, NCBC Resources.
And you'll see the very first thing, it says Topics in Catholic Bioethics. If you click on that, you'll see a whole bunch of different topics. You can scroll down, and there's any number of different topics. And I think reproductive technologies is probably down under R. So you can get all sorts of information there about various different topics.
Wow, there's so many topics. For those that aren't watching me scroll through it, that's your friendly time. Nutrition, hydration, organ donation, physician-assisted suicide, privacy, reproductive technologies. There it is.
There it is. Yeah, it's never a boring day at the NCBC, I'll tell you.
Adoption and foster care. Oh my goodness, we didn't even mention that, adoption and foster care. Obviously, we would encourage people to go to physicians that can address the problem of infertility. And then if that can't be corrected, then of course we're going to encourage adoption or foster care, right, for growing your family. So that's another thing that we should also plug.
Absolutely.
Since we're on the website, what if we have a question and we want to contact an ethicist for a more personal conversation? Is that possible?
Well, actually, there's a couple ways you could do that. So if you're looking at those buttons on the top of the page, Bob, you see over on the right side, there's a red button that says Free Ethics Consult.
Yeah, there it is.
Just click on that, and it gives you the ability, you can type in a question, or you can call us up and ask. And it's kind of 50-50. Some people call, some people type in a question. And we try to get back to everyone within 24 hours, but some of that depends on volume of calls in a particular day or volume of emails in a particular day. But yeah, we have a 24-hour consult service. People can call us us, email us, and ask us anything. And believe me, we get everything. The majority of questions have to do with end of life. So if someone's calling, it's usually the designated decision maker, usually for a parent who's very ill. And, they have a question about some level of care or pain medications or hospice or any number of different questions. So that's available and it's all free.
Terrific. So once again, for the listeners especially, www.ncbcenter.org. From there, you click on the free ethics consult and you can find the email or the phone number.
So if people would like to get in touch with me directly, my direct email is JZALOT, so JZalot, at ncbcenter.org.
Well, thanks, Joe, for being a part of this podcast today, sharing with our listeners about IVF, why it's a problematic procedure that most people don't even know about, and why it shouldn't be touted as a solution to the problem of infertility, and why there are some better options out there for couples who are struggling to conceive. So thanks, Joe, for coming up on the show.
Thanks. Anytime.
And I want to thank all our viewers and listeners for tuning in on this episode of our Being Pro-Life series. Head to the website to view all the links talked about in this episode at www.catholicaoc.org/beingprolife. Thanks again for joining us today. I look forward to being with you next time.